March 15, 2019, Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. Carlos Mendoza was wiping down glasses when 20 men in tactical gear kicked down his cantina door. They moved like ghosts, no words, no hesitation, straight to the woman sitting alone at table 6. Emma Coronel didn't scream, didn't run. She looked at Carlos once, a look that said everything and nothing, then walked out between her captors like she'd been expecting this moment her entire life. 48 hours later, Carlos woke up in a concrete cell with water up to his chest. His ribs were broken, his left eye was swollen shut, and carved into the wall above his head were 3 words that changed everything. She knows, Papa. The Zetas hadn't grabbed El Chapo's wife for ransom. They'd grabbed his daughter, the daughter Carlos thought he'd lost 15 years ago. The daughter whose disappearance had started this whole bloody game. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Carlos stared at those 3 words until his vision blurred. She knows, Papa. The water in his cell had risen another inch while he'd been unconscious, and the salt taste told him it wasn't rainwater. The Zetas had dumped him somewhere near the coast, probably one of their torture houses in Mazatlan or Culiacan. His fingers traced the carved letters, fresh, done while he was out. Someone wanted him to see this the moment he woke up. 15 years. 15 years he'd believed his daughter Sofia was dead. 15 years of drowning himself in mezcal and self-hatred, running that little cantina like penance for the choice that destroyed everything. The night he'd made a deal with Joaquin El Chapo Guzman to get her back, trading DEA intelligence for his child's life. Except the trade never happened. They'd told him she was already dead, shot during the rescue attempt, her body never found. But Emma Coronel was 29 years old. Sofia would be 30 now. The math was wrong. Everything was wrong. Carlos tried to stand, but his left leg buckled. Something was broken below the knee. The Zetas had worked him over professionally. Nothing fatal, just enough to keep him compliant. They wanted him alive and thinking. That was almost worse than wanting him dead. Water dripped from somewhere above, each drop echoing off concrete walls like a countdown timer. He'd been in cells like this during his DEA days, usually on the other side of the bars. The irony wasn't lost on him. A metal door scraped open above his head. Footsteps on stairs he couldn't see. Carlos Mendoza. The voice belonged to someone young, maybe mid-20s, confident. American-educated accent underneath the Spanish. Former DEA special agent. Decorated, respected. Until March 3, 2004, when you traded government secrets for your daughter's life. A flashlight beam hit Carlos in the face. Behind it, he could make out a figure in expensive clothes. Not standard Zeta gear. Except she wasn't your daughter, was she? That's what you've been telling yourself for 15 years. That Sofia Mendoza died that night. That you sacrificed your career for nothing. Carlos said nothing. In situations like this, silence was survival. But Emma Coronel knew different. She's known since she was 14 years old. Known that her real father was a DEA agent. Known that El Chapo stole her from you and raised her as his own. Made her his wife when she turned 18. The flashlight lowered, and Carlos could see the speaker now. Young, clean-shaven, wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in a year. This wasn't some cartel sicario. This was someone who gave orders to people who gave orders to sicarios. She's been planning to contact you for years, waiting for the right moment, but someone's been watching. Someone who needed El Chapo's empire to fall and Los Zetas to rise, and you, the young man smiled. You were the perfect catalyst. Who are you? Carlos's voice came out as a croak. I'm the son of your former partner, Agent Thomas Morrison. Ring any bells? Carlos felt the water around his chest turn to ice. Morrison had been his handler during the Sofia kidnapping. Morrison had coordinated the failed rescue. Morrison had told him she was dead. My father spent 15 years building Los Zetas from the inside, feeding them intelligence, eliminating their competition, creating a monopoly. The Sinaloa cartel was the last major obstacle, and El Chapo was too smart to take down directly. The pieces fell into place like dominoes. So you used Emma, used me, we used the truth. Emma really is your daughter. She really was planning to reach out. We just accelerated the timeline, Made sure she came to your cantina. Made sure the Zetas knew where to find her. Carlos lunged forward, but his broken leg sent him crashing back against the concrete wall. Pain exploded through his ribs. Where is she? Safe. For now. My father wants to meet you first. He's been looking forward to this reunion for a very long time. The young man turned toward the stairs, then paused. Oh, and Carlos? Emma left something for you. In case you didn't believe. He tossed a small object into the water. Carlos fumbled for it, his fingers closing around metal. A locket. Sophia's locket, the one he'd given her for her 15th birthday, 2 weeks before she was taken. Inside was a photo he'd never seen before. Emma Coronel at maybe 16 years old, standing next to El Chapo. But her eyes were Sophia's eyes, his wife's eyes. On the back, in handwriting he recognized from homework help and birthday cards, were 4 words, "I never forgot, Papa." The door slammed shut. The water continued to rise. Carlos held the locket against his chest and realized that his 15-year nightmare was just beginning. 15 years earlier. The birthday cake had been chocolate with vanilla frosting, Sophia's favorite since she turned 7. Carlos could still smell it sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep refused to come. The memory lived in his fingertips, the weight of the small velvet box, the way Sophia's eyes had lit up when she'd opened it to find the silver locket inside. "It's beautiful, Papa." Her 15-year-old voice caught between childhood and something more complicated. She'd fastened it around her neck immediately, the pendant catching the candlelight. "I'll never take it off." 2 weeks later, she was gone. The water in Carlos's cell had risen to his shoulders now, and each breath was becoming deliberate, measured. He pressed his back against the concrete wall, fighting to stay upright with his broken leg, the locket clutched so tightly in his fist that the chain cut into his palm. The pain kept him anchored to the present, prevented him from drowning in the past. But the past came anyway, as relentless as the rising water. He'd been Special Agent Carlos Mendoza then, 15 years younger and still believing the war on drugs was winnable, still believing the system worked. His wife Maria had been alive, beautiful, patient Maria who'd made their small house in Phoenix feel like sanctuary after the brutal undercover assignments. She'd been the one to suggest the birthday party, insisting Sophia needed normal teenage moments, despite Carlos's growing paranoia about cartel retaliation. "You can't protect her from the world forever, mi amor," Maria had said, frosting the cake while Carlos checked the security system for the 3rd time that day. "She's 15. She needs to feel like her life belongs to her." But her life hadn't belonged to her. It had belonged to Joaquin Guzman, who'd been watching, planning, waiting for the perfect moment to take everything Carlos loved and twist it into a weapon. The kidnapping had been surgical, professional. Sophia walking home from school on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 blocks from their house, vanishing between one security camera and the next. No witnesses, no trace. Just a phone call 6 hours later with a voice that spoke perfect English and made impossible demands. "Your daughter for your cooperation, Agent Mendoza. We know what you know. We know who you've been watching. Give us the operations files for Sinaloa interdiction, and she comes home." Carlos had said yes without hesitation, had burned 15 years of DEA work in a single decision, choosing love over duty. But the trade had gone wrong, or so he'd believed. Shots fired during the exchange, blood on the warehouse floor. Morrison, his partner, pulling him away from the scene while he screamed Sophia's name into the darkness. "She's gone, Carlos. I'm sorry." The rescue team found evidence of execution. "We're too late. Too late." The words had followed him through the investigation, the suspension, the divorce. Maria couldn't look at him after the funeral for their daughter's empty casket, couldn't forgive him for the choice he'd made, even though she'd have made the same one. The house in Phoenix had become a mausoleum, every room echoing with Sophia's absence. So he'd run, cross the border like so many others seeking a different life, or maybe just a different kind of death. Puerto Vallarta had seemed far enough from Phoenix, close enough to the cartels to feel like the penance he deserved. The cantina had been for sale, run down and forgotten on a side street where tourists didn't venture. Perfect for a man who wanted to disappear into the bottom of a bottle. 15 years of pouring drinks for fishermen and dock workers. 15 years of Spanish soap operas playing on a television with bad reception. 15 years of telling himself that Sofia was at peace, that his choice had at least given her death meaning, even if it had destroyed everything else. But she hadn't died. She'd grown up, become a woman, married the man who'd stolen her childhood and called him husband. The locket's metal was warming in his palm, drawing heat from his body even as the salt water crept higher. He could feel the photo inside, protected by the seal his younger self had chosen carefully. A father's gift, meant to hold memories of innocence. Instead, it had held evidence of a crime that spanned decades. Emma Coronel, El Chapo's child bride to the world, but Sofia Mendoza to the father who'd never stopped mourning her. How many times had Carlos seen her face on television, standing beside Guzman during court appearances? How many times had he looked into those eyes, Maria's eyes, without recognizing his own daughter? The irony was suffocating. He'd spent 15 years running from the cartels, hiding in plain sight, serving drinks to the same kinds of men who'd destroyed his family. And all that time Sofia had been alive, married to their king, waiting for a reunion that Morrison and his son had orchestrated like puppet masters pulling strings from the shadows. The water touched his chin now. Soon he'd have to choose between drowning and floating, between giving up and fighting for a daughter who might already be dead by the time he saw daylight again. Carlos closed his eyes and made the same choice he'd made 15 years ago. He chose Sofia. The metal door above scraped open again, but this time the footsteps were different, heavier, deliberate. The measured pace of someone who'd walked these stairs 1,000 times before. Carlos kept his eyes closed, floating now with the locket pressed against his chest. The water had reached his neck, forcing him to tilt his head back to breathe. Let them think he was broken. Let them think 15 years of guilt had finally drowned him. "Hello, Carlos." The voice hit him like a physical blow. Familiar, unchanged. The same tone that had briefed him on operations, that had talked him through the worst moments of his career, that had held him back from the warehouse where his daughter supposedly died. Thomas Morrison. Carlos opened his eyes. His former partner stood on a narrow platform that had been invisible in the darkness, maybe 8 feet above the water level. Morrison looked older, gray hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but he wore the same expensive suit he'd always favored. Still the golden boy of the DEA, apparently. "Surprised I'm still breathing?" Carlos managed, treading water with his good leg. Morrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm surprised you lasted this long in that cantina. Drinking yourself to death seemed more your style. Maybe I was waiting for something." "For her." Morrison pulled out a tablet, the screen casting blue light across his face. "Emma Coronel, your Sofia. She's quite beautiful, isn't she? Takes after Maria." The casual mention of his dead wife made Carlos's vision blur with rage. "Don't." "Oh, but I should. I knew Maria well, remember? All those department barbecues. All those times she worried about you working too deep undercover. She used to ask me to watch out for you." Morrison's smile widened. "I promised her I would." The water lapped at Carlos's mouth as he struggled to stay afloat. "You son of a bitch. You orchestrated everything." "I orchestrated survival. Do you have any idea what the cartels were doing to this region 15 years ago? The Sinaloa cartel, the Gulf cartel, Los Zetas, the Knights Templar. Dozens of factions tearing Mexico apart. Chaos, unpredictable violence that spilled across every border." Morrison began pacing the small platform, his voice taking on the lecturing tone Carlos remembered from briefings. "But chaos can be managed if you have the right leverage, the right information, the right people in the right places. So you built Los Zetas. I guided them, strengthened them, fed them intelligence that eliminated their competitors one by one, created a monopoly that could be controlled." Morrison paused, looking down at Carlos with something that might have been pity. "The drug trade was never going to disappear, Carlos. But it could be organized, managed, made cleaner." Carlos felt his strength ebbing, his broken leg dragging him down. And Sofia was just collateral damage. Sofia was an opportunity. El Chapo had been impossible to touch, too smart, too well protected. But a man in love makes mistakes. A man protecting a child makes even bigger ones. Morrison crouched at the platform's edge, close enough now that Carlos could see the calculation in his eyes. I needed Guzman to trust someone inside the DEA. You were perfect, decorated, respected, incorruptible, until you weren't. The pieces fell into place like shards of broken glass, each one cutting deeper than the last. The kidnapping was real. Oh yes, Guzman took her exactly as planned. But the rescue? Morrison shook his head. There was never going to be a rescue, Carlos. The blood we found belonged to some sicario who'd outlived his usefulness. Sofia was already on a plane to Sinaloa, already beginning her new life as Joaquin's ward. Carlos went under for a moment, salt water burning his throat before he fought back to the surface. You told me she was dead. I told you what you needed to hear, what would keep you broken and compliant. A dead daughter was tragic but final. A living daughter in cartel hands. Morrison stood, smoothing his jacket. That was leverage that could last decades. She knew. Emma knew who I was. She's known since she was 16. Started asking questions about her life before Joaquin. Too smart for her own good, just like her father. Morrison's expression softened, almost paternal. I've been watching her for years, Carlos. Watching both of you. Waiting for the right moment to bring this full circle. The water was at Carlos's ears now, forcing him to arch his neck at an impossible angle. Why now? Because Los Zetas needed one final push to eliminate the Sinaloa cartel completely. Because Emma was getting too close to the truth, and because... Morrison paused, his mask slipping for just a moment. Because my son needed to prove himself. Consider this his graduation exercise. Carlos felt his feet touch bottom as he sank, the concrete floor slippery with algae. His lungs burned. The locket seemed to pulse against his chest like a second heartbeat. Where is she? He gasped. Morrison was already turning toward the stairs. Close. Closer than you think. But first, you're going to help me finish what we started 15 years ago. The lights went out. The water kept rising. And somewhere in the darkness above, Carlos could swear he heard a woman crying. The crying stopped when the lights went out, but the silence that replaced it was worse. Carlos floated in absolute darkness, his broken leg useless beneath him, listening to the water lap against concrete walls that had become his tomb. The locket burned against his chest, not from heat, but from the weight of 15 years of lies finally collapsing into truth. Sofia was alive, had been alive this entire time, married to the monster who'd stolen her childhood, while Carlos had been pouring drinks and drowning in guilt 300 miles away. He tried to push the revelation aside, to focus on survival, but his mind kept fracturing. Every memory he'd buried came flooding back with the salt water that filled his mouth each time he slipped under the surface. Sofia at 10, helping him clean his service weapon while Maria scolded them both from the kitchen. Sofia at 13, rolling her eyes at his overprotectiveness, but still hugging him goodnight. Sofia at 15, fastening the locket around her neck and promising never to take it off. She'd kept that promise. The water was at his nose now. Carlos tilted his head back until his neck screamed in protest, but it bought him maybe 10 more minutes of air. 10 minutes to figure out why Morrison needed him alive, why this elaborate reunion required more than simple execution. Because you're going to help me finish what we started 15 years ago. What had they started? Carlos's cooperation had given Morrison access to DEA intelligence, but that pipeline had died with his resignation. Unless... The realization hit him as another wave of water filled his mouth. Morrison hadn't just been building Los Zetas for 15 years. He'd been positioning himself within the DEA hierarchy, using Carlos's disgrace as proof of his own loyalty. The partner who'd tried to save a corrupt agent, the handler who'd pulled his man back from a compromised operation. Morrison hadn't just survived Carlos's downfall, he'd used it to rise through the ranks, which meant Morrison was still inside, still feeding intelligence to Los Zetas, still orchestrating cartel wars from a government office in Phoenix or Dallas or Washington, D.C. But something had changed. Morrison's son had called this a graduation exercise, which suggested the old man was ready to step back, pass the torch. And for that transition to work, certain loose ends needed tying up, like El Chapo's widow asking too many questions about her past. like a broken-down former agent who might remember inconvenient details if the wrong person came asking. Carlos went under again, his lungs burning as salt water invaded his sinuses. When he fought back to the surface, gasping, he could hear voices above. Not Morrison this time. Younger voices, speaking rapid Spanish with the flat accent of Mexico City, Zeta soldiers probably, discussing something with the casual tone of men who killed for a living. He caught fragments. The woman, Morrison says wait. Morning shift change. The woman, Sophia. They had her somewhere close, just as Morrison had promised. Close enough that her crying had carried down to this flooded cell. Close enough that Carlos could almost feel her presence like a phantom limb, the part of his soul that had been missing for 15 years. But knowing she was near and being able to reach her were different problems entirely. Carlos tested his range of motion in the water, cataloging his injuries. The broken leg would slow him down but wouldn't stop him. The ribs were cracked but not displaced. His left shoulder felt wrong, dislocated probably, but functional enough. The real problem was the water. It was still rising, maybe an inch every few minutes. Whatever drainage system this place had was either blocked or designed to fill slowly. A torture device disguised as a holding cell. Carlos forced himself to think like the agent he'd once been. Morrison wanted him compliant, desperate, broken down enough to agree to whatever plan came next. But Morrison also needed him functional enough to be useful, which meant the water would stop rising before it killed him. Had to. Unless Morrison had miscalculated. The voices above grew louder, more agitated. Carlos caught something about a schedule change, about someone being late for their shift. Then footsteps, moving away from his position. In the silence that followed, Carlos heard it again, crying, but muffled now, as if someone was trying to stay quiet, as if they knew sound carried in this place and didn't want to draw attention. Sophia, he whispered to the darkness. The crying stopped instantly. Carlos held his breath, straining to listen. Then, so quiet he almost missed it beneath the sound of lapping water, came a voice he hadn't heard in 15 years, older now, roughened by whatever she'd endured, but unmistakably his daughter. Papa? The word broke something inside him that had been held together by scar tissue and stubborn denial. Carlos pressed his face against the concrete wall, feeling for any crack or opening that might carry sound. I'm here, Mia. I'm here. Above him, a door slammed. Heavy footsteps on stairs. Morrison's son was coming back. The footsteps stopped halfway down the stairs. Carlos held his breath, the water now lapping at his lower lip as he tilted his head back at an impossible angle. Through the concrete, Sophia's voice came again, a whispered papa that carried 15 years of questions he'd never be able to answer. How touching! Morrison's son's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. Father said you two might try to communicate. Sound travels remarkably well through these old drainage systems. A flashlight beam stabbed down, momentarily blinding Carlos before settling into a steady glare. Morrison's son, Jake, Morrison had called him, crouched on the platform where his father had stood minutes before. Up close, the family resemblance was unmistakable. Same calculating eyes, same predatory smile. You know what the beautiful thing is about this setup? Jake's voice carried the casual enthusiasm of someone discussing a hobby. The water level is controlled from upstairs. I can make it rise faster, slower, or stop completely. Your breathing space depends entirely on how cooperative you decide to be. Carlos felt his feet slip on the algae-covered bottom, sending him under for a terrifying moment before he clawed back to the surface. What do you want? Information. Specifically, about your friend El Chapo's recent activities. We know Sophia, has been receiving coded messages through intermediaries. Messages that suggest her dear husband left her more than just a marriage certificate when he went to prison. The water crept higher as Jake spoke, forcing Carlos to crane his neck until the tendons felt ready to snap. I don't know anything about Guzman's operations. No, but your daughter does. And she trusts you now that she knows who you are. Amazing what a father's voice can accomplish, even after 15 years of thinking he was dead. Above them, through the concrete and steel, Carlos heard a door slam. Then Sophia's voice again, louder this time, speaking rapid Spanish to someone else. Her tone was angry, defiant, Maria's fire burning in their daughter's words. Jake's smile widened. She's quite spirited. Refused to answer our questions for nearly 6 hours now. My associates are growing impatient. Don't touch her. The words came out as a growl, primal and desperate. That depends entirely on you. Jake pulled out a tablet, its screen casting eerie light across the water's surface. El Chapo built an empire, but he was smart enough to compartmentalize. Hidden accounts, safe houses, weapons caches, all documented in a very special insurance policy that he entrusted to his beloved wife. Carlos's vision began to blur as the water touched his mouth. He had to fight to keep his head above the surface. Even if that's true. Oh, it's true. We've confirmed it through multiple sources. The question is where Emma hid it. She's proven remarkably resistant to conventional interrogation, but perhaps a father's request might be more persuasive. The pieces clicked together like bullets sliding into a chamber. Morrison hadn't just been playing both sides for 15 years. He'd been positioning Los Zetas to inherit everything when the old cartels fell. But Guzman's information cache was the key to that inheritance. Without it, they'd be fighting a war blind against enemies they couldn't identify. You're going to ask her yourself, Jake continued, standing and moving toward a control panel Carlos hadn't noticed before. In about 30 minutes, we'll bring you both to the same room. You'll convince her that cooperation is the only way to keep you both alive. She'll tell us where to find Guzman's files. Everyone wins. And then you kill us both. Jake's hand hovered over what looked like a valve wheel. Well, yes. But you'll die knowing you saved her from hours of unnecessary suffering. That has to count for something. The water suddenly surged upward as Jake turned the valve. Carlos went under, his lungs burning as he fought back to the surface. There was no air left. The water had reached the ceiling of his cell. He was drowning in a concrete coffin, breathing the last few cubic inches of space, while his daughter waited somewhere above for a reunion that would end in both their deaths. But as his vision darkened, Carlos felt something else. The locket had shifted against his chest, its chain tangling around his fingers as he struggled to stay afloat. The metal was warm, not from his body heat, but from something inside, something that had been waiting 15 years to be discovered. Morrison had orchestrated everything, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that Carlos's gift to his daughter had been purely sentimental, a father's token of love with no practical value. He'd never bothered to examine what else might be hidden inside that carefully sealed locket. Carlos smiled as the water closed over his head for what might be the last time. Morrison wanted his daughter to trust him, wanted them reunited for one final manipulation? Perfect. Because Sophia wasn't the only one who'd been keeping secrets for 15 years, and some gifts were more dangerous than their givers ever intended. The water pressure equalized with a mechanical clunk somewhere above, and Carlos felt himself sinking into the sudden stillness. His lungs screamed for oxygen, but his fingers worked with desperate precision, following the chain of the locket to where it had twisted around his wrist. The metal clasp was swollen from years of saltwater exposure, but it gave way under his desperate pressure. Inside the locket, pressed against his daughter's 15-year-old photograph, was a micro SD card sealed in waterproof resin. Carlos's vision exploded with stars as he fought to the surface, gasping in the thin air pocket that remained. The revelation hit him harder than the near drowning. He'd been carrying Guzman's insurance policy for 15 years, hidden in the one place Morrison would never think to look. The locket hadn't just been a father's gift, it had been a dead drop, placed there the night Sophia was taken. But that meant Guzman had planned her kidnapping from the beginning. The implications cascaded through Carlos's oxygen-starved brain like dominoes falling. If Guzman had orchestrated Sophia's abduction, then Morrison hadn't been playing puppet master after all. He'd been dancing to someone else's strings, thinking he was manipulating the chess pieces while the real player watched from shadows. "Jesus Christ," Carlos whispered to the darkness. "You magnificent bastard." Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Jake's voice carried panic for the first time. "Where the hell is it?" The tracker went dead. A hiss of hydraulics, and the water began draining with shocking speed. Carlos found himself standing waist-deep, then knee-deep, then on solid ground as emergency pumps roared to life. Jake bounded down the stairs 3 at a time, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. "The locket," Jake snarled. Where's the fucking locket? Carlos held up his empty hands, the broken chain dangling between his fingers. The SD card was palmed against his right wrist, smaller than a fingernail and worth more than every cartel in Mexico combined. Lost it when the water rose. Check the drain. Jake's composure cracked completely. He grabbed Carlos by the throat, slamming him against the concrete wall. My father spent 15 years positioning us for this moment. 15 years of building Los Zetas into the dominant force in Mexico. You will not— Your father's an idiot, Carlos interrupted, and Jake's grip loosened in surprise. You want to know why Guzman never tried to contact his wife directly? Why he let her live in limbo for years, never knowing if her past was real? Jake's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. Because she was never the target. I was. Carlos smiled, tasting blood from his split lip. Guzman knew Morrison was dirty from day one, knew exactly who was feeding intelligence to Los Zetas, so he gave me the real treasure map and let Morrison think he was stealing worthless sentiment. The sound that escaped Jake's throat wasn't quite human. No, you're lying. Father tracked every communication, every communication Morrison knew about. Carlos straightened, despite the grip on his throat. But Guzman didn't get where he was by trusting anyone completely. Even his own wife doesn't know what's hidden in that locket. She's been protecting a decoy this whole time. Above them, a new sound cut through the facility. Gunfire, automatic weapons, the staccato rhythm of a coordinated assault. Jake released Carlos and spun toward the stairs, his hand moving to the pistol at his belt. Sinaloa, Carlos said quietly. Guzman's real insurance policy wasn't information, it was loyalty. How many of his lieutenants do you think have been waiting 15 years for that tracker signal to go active? Jake's face went white. The tracker, built into the SD card, activated by water pressure when the locket was opened underwater. Carlos could hear Sofia's voice above, no longer crying but shouting orders in rapid Spanish. Commands that carried the authority of someone who'd been planning this moment for longer than Jake had been alive. Your graduation exercise just became a war, boy, and you're on the wrong side. More gunfire erupted overhead, closer now. Jake raised his pistol, hands shaking as he pointed it at Carlos's chest. Give me the card. What card? Carlos spread his fingers, showing empty palms while the SD card remained pressed against his wrist. I told you, it's somewhere in the drainage system. Probably halfway to the Gulf of Mexico by now. Jake's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the lights went out again. In the darkness, Carlos heard his daughter's voice one more time, not crying now, not questioning, but absolutely certain. Papa, get down. The explosion that followed brought down half the ceiling and reminded Carlos why El Chapo's wife had never needed rescuing. She'd been planning the rescue herself. The dust from the explosion hung in the air like fog as Carlos pressed himself against the rubble-strewn wall. Above him, the firefight raged with the precision of a military operation, Sofia's voice cutting through the chaos, directing her forces with an authority that made his chest tight with pride and terror in equal measure. Jake Morrison lay motionless beneath a concrete beam, his pistol just out of reach. Blood trickled from his temple, but his chest still rose and fell, alive but unconscious. Carlos stepped over him and climbed through the hole that had been blasted in the wall, following the sound of his daughter's commands. The facility's upper level was a war zone. Bodies in tactical gear, Los Zetas soldiers, were scattered across the corridor like broken dolls. Smoke billowed from demolished doorways, and the acrid smell of C4 hung heavy in the air. Through it all, Carlos heard Sofia coordinating the assault with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been planning this operation for years, not hours. He found her in what had once been Morrison's control room, standing over the older man's prone form, while 2 Sinaloa gunmen covered the exits. She'd changed from the frightened wife he'd tried to comfort in his cantina into something else entirely, a commander who'd inherited her husband's strategic mind and her father's stubborn determination. Morrison was conscious but bleeding from multiple wounds. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man watching his life's work collapse in real time. 15 years, Sofia said without turning around. Carlos realized she was speaking to him, not Morrison. 15 years I've known this day would come, ever since I started remembering things that didn't match the story they told me about my childhood. Carlos stepped into the room, glass crunching under his boots. Sofia. Emma. Her voice was sharp, cutting. Sofia Mendoza died the night she was taken from her father's house. Emma Coronel was born in that Los Zetas compound, raised to be the perfect cartel wife, trained to seduce and marry the most wanted man in Mexico. She turned then, and Carlos saw his own eyes staring back at him from a face that had inherited Maria's fierce beauty and something else, something harder, forged in the furnace of 15 years spent playing a role that could have gotten her killed at any moment. But I remembered your voice, she continued. Remembered the lullabies you used to sing when I had nightmares. Remembered the weight of that locket around my neck and how you promised it would keep me safe. Morrison tried to speak, blood frothing at his lips. Sofia glanced down at him with the mild interest of someone examining an insect. He's been trying to explain how this isn't his fault, she said. How he was just following orders, building assets, serving his country. Remarkable how patriotic traitors become when they're facing execution. Carlos felt the SD card burning against his wrist. The locket. Joaquin told me what was inside it before they transferred him to Florence. Told me how he'd hidden his real insurance policy with the one person Morrison would never suspect. Sofia's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. The broken DEA agent who'd been drowning his guilt in tequila for 15 years. Who'd walk around Puerto Vallarta wearing his daughter's memory around his neck, never knowing he was carrying enough information to topple governments. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Guzman hadn't just been playing chess. He'd been playing four-dimensional chess while everyone else was still learning checkers. He'd let Morrison think he was orchestrating Sofia's placement as the perfect deep-cover asset, never realizing that she was actually Guzman's agent inside Los Zetas. He'd allowed himself to be captured, knowing that Sofia would eventually lead Carlos to this moment. You've been in contact with him, Carlos said, all these years. Through intermediaries, coded messages, instructions wrapped in love letters from a devoted wife to her imprisoned husband. Sofia's expression softened slightly. He told me to watch over you, said that when the time came, my real father would have everything we needed to end this war. Morrison made a strangled sound. Sofia looked down at him again, and Carlos saw something in her face that reminded him uncomfortably of El Chapo himself, the cold calculation of someone who'd learned to see people as assets to be managed or obstacles to be removed. The question now, she continued, is what we do with the information you've been carrying. We could use it to hunt down every Los Zetas cell, every corrupted official, every dirty agent Morrison's been running for the past 15 years. Or, Carlos asked, though he already knew the answer. Sofia's smile was her mother's smile, but her eyes belonged to the most dangerous man in Mexico. Or we use it to build something new, something that serves our interests instead of theirs. Outside, the gunfire was dying down. Carlos heard vehicles approaching, more Sinaloa forces probably, coming to secure the area. In a few minutes, this conversation would become academic. Sofia would make her choice, and Carlos would have to live with the consequences, just like 15 years ago, when he'd made a deal with the devil to save his daughter's life. The only difference was that this time, his daughter had become the devil. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, but Carlos barely heard them. He was staring at his daughter, this woman who carried Sofia's face but spoke with the calculating precision of a cartel leader, and feeling the weight of 15 years pressing down on him like the water in that concrete cell. You want to know what the real tragedy is? Carlos pulled the SD card from his wrist, holding it up so the emergency lighting caught its surface. Your mother died believing you were dead. Spent 3 years drinking herself into the grave because she thought I'd failed to save you. Something flickered in Sofia's eyes, a crack in that perfect cartel composure. Maria used to sit in your room, Carlos continued, his voice growing stronger, hours every night, holding your clothes, talking to your photographs like you were still there. She died waiting for me to bring you home, and I let her, because I thought you were dead too. Papa. The word slipped out before Sofia could stop it, and Carlos saw the little girl he'd sung to sleep 15 years ago. Morrison killed her as surely as if he'd put a gun to her head. Carlos looked down at the broken DEA agent, who was watching this exchange with the desperate attention of a man looking for any leverage to save his life. But Guzman, he just used her grief, used mine, let us destroy ourselves while he played his long game. Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as a wet whisper. The greater good, national security. Shut up. Carlos didn't take his eyes off Sophia. You said we could build something new. What did you mean? Sophia glanced toward the windows where vehicle lights were now visible. Joaquin's network spans 6 countries: banking, shipping, government contacts, legitimate businesses alongside the cartels. With Morrison's intelligence files, we could eliminate the competition and create something cleaner, still trafficking, still killing, but organized, controlled, fewer bodies, less chaos. Sophia's voice carried the same reasonable tone Carlos had heard from a dozen cartel leaders over the years, smart people who'd convinced themselves that managing evil was the same as stopping it. The demand will always exist. At least we could minimize the collateral damage. Carlos felt something break inside his chest, not his heart, but something deeper. The last illusion he'd been carrying about who his daughter had become. Your mother would be ashamed. The words hit Sophia like a physical blow. Her composure shattered completely, and for a moment she looked exactly like the 6-year-old who used to run crying into his arms after playground fights. Mama's dead because of choices you made. The scream tore out of her throat, raw and 15 years old. You chose to save me by making a deal with criminals. You chose to let Morrison disappear us instead of fighting. Every choice you made led to this moment. You're right. Carlos crushed the SD card between his fingers and heard Morrison make a sound like a dying animal. Every choice I made was wrong. Starting with the night I decided that saving my daughter was worth more than stopping the cartels. Sophia stared at the destroyed card, her face cycling through shock, rage, and something that might have been relief. That was worth billions. Governments would have fallen. Good. Carlos stepped toward her and saw her hand move instinctively to the pistol at her belt. Because those governments failed us. The cartels failed us. The DEA failed us. Everyone with power failed the people they were supposed to protect. Morrison was trying to speak again, blood bubbling from his lips. Years of work, national assets. Carlos knelt beside him, close enough to whisper, Your son is dead downstairs. Your network is compromised. Your life's work just got crushed into plastic fragments. How does it feel to lose everything? But he wasn't really talking to Morrison. He was talking to Sophia, who was watching her own future crumble along with the card that would have made her the most powerful criminal in Mexico. We can't change what we are, Carlos said, standing again to face his daughter. I'm a failed agent who chose family over duty. You're a cartel wife who chose survival over innocence. But we can choose what happens next. The vehicles outside had stopped, doors slammed, and Carlos heard boots on pavement. Sophia's remaining soldiers would be taking positions, preparing for whatever came next. The Sinaloa forces expect you to take control, Carlos said. Guzman's wife, stepping into her husband's empire. They'll follow you into hell if you ask them to. Sophia's hand remained on her weapon. And if I don't? Then walk away. Tonight. Leave it all behind and disappear. Carlos spread his hands, showing her the plastic fragments that had been worth more than human lives. No empire, no revenge, no continuing the cycle that killed your mother and destroyed our family. For a long moment the only sound was Morrison's labored breathing and the distant murmur of voices from outside. Then Sophia smiled, not the predator's smile she'd worn as Emma Coronel, but something sadder and more real. You're asking me to choose between everything I've built and everything I've lost. I'm asking you to choose between becoming them or remembering who you used to be. Outside, someone was shouting orders in Spanish. The reckoning was coming, and there was no more time for conversation. Sophia drew her pistol and aimed it at Morrison's head. Some choices, she said, aren't that difficult after all. The gunshot echoed through the ruined facility like a thunderclap, and for a moment, everything went silent. Morrison's body jerked once, then lay still, blood pooling beneath his shattered skull. Sophia lowered the weapon slowly, her hand trembling for the first time since Carlos had found her in this room. "That was for Mama," she whispered, and Carlos heard his 6-year-old daughter in those words. The voices outside grew louder, Sinaloa lieutenants calling for Emma, for orders, for direction. They'd followed the tracker signal here, expecting to find their patron's wife ready to claim her inheritance. Instead, they'd find something else entirely. Sophia holstered her pistol and walked to the shattered window. Below in the courtyard, dozens of armed men waited in the harsh glare of vehicle headlights. Carlos could see their faces, hard men who'd spent years fighting Los Zetas, who'd bled for the Sinaloa cartel, who expected their sacrifices to mean something. "They're good soldiers," Sophia said without turning around. "They deserve better than another war." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a satellite phone, the kind cartel leaders used for communications that couldn't be intercepted. Carlos watched her scroll through contacts, then hesitate with her finger over the screen. "There's a boat waiting in Puerto Vallarta," she said, small, unremarkable. "Captain who doesn't ask questions. It could take 2 passengers to somewhere the cartels can't reach. And the soldiers downstairs?" Sophia finally turned to face him, and Carlos saw Maria's strength in her expression, the same fierce determination that had carried his wife through 3 years of grief. "They'll go home to their families. The war dies with Morrison, with his network, with the information we destroyed tonight." Outside, someone was calling for Emma in increasingly urgent tones. Soon they'd come looking, and this moment of choice would be over. "I spent 15 years learning to be someone else," Sophia continued. "Emma Coronel, the perfect cartel wife. I wore her like armor, let her make the hard choices while Sophia stayed buried underneath. But Emma was never real. She was just another one of Morrison's weapons." Carlos stepped closer, glass crunching under his boots. "And now? Now I choose who I want to be." Sophia's smile was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "I want to be your daughter again, Papa. Just your daughter. Not a cartel queen, not a symbol, not a weapon in someone else's war." The satellite phone buzzed in her hands, an incoming call that made both of them freeze. The caller ID showed only a number, but Carlos knew who it had to be. El Chapo himself, calling from his Supermax cell to check on his wife's progress. Sophia looked at the screen for a long moment, then powered the phone down without answering. "Some conversations," she said, "are better left unfinished." The sound of boots on the stairs interrupted them. A Sinaloa lieutenant appeared in the doorway, automatic rifle in his hands, scanning the room with professional efficiency. His eyes took in Morrison's corpse, the destruction, the broken window, before settling on Sophia. "Señora," he said in rapid Spanish, "we've secured the facility. Los Zetas resistance has been eliminated. What are your orders?" Sophia straightened, and for a moment Carlos saw Emma Coronel emerge one final time, the commanding presence that had held together a criminal empire while its leader rotted in American prison. "Stand down," she said in perfect, unaccented Spanish. "All forces return to base. The operation is complete. And the territory? The Los Zetas assets?" Sophia walked to Morrison's desk and pulled out a piece of paper, writing quickly. "Distribute them among the families of our fallen soldiers. No new operations, no expansion. The war is over." The lieutenant's confusion was visible, but he'd been trained not to question orders from El Chapo's wife. He took the paper with a sharp nod. "Sí, señora." "And you?" "I'm retiring," Sophia said simply. "Tell them Emma Coronel died tonight, along with Morrison and his network. The cartels can fight over the scraps." After the lieutenant left, father and daughter stood alone in the ruins of the facility that had started this nightmare. Dawn was beginning to creep through the broken windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "The boat captain," Carlos said. "He really doesn't ask questions?" Sophia smiled, not Emma's calculating expression, but something genuine and young. "I asked him once what he'd do if he could sail anywhere in the world. He said he'd always wanted to see the sunrise over Costa Rica." Carlos looked around the room one last time, at Morrison's corpse, at the fragments of the SD card, at the blood and debris that marked the end of 15 years of lies. Then he took his daughter's hand, feeling her fingers intertwine with his for the first time since she was 6 years old. Together, they walked toward the stairs, toward the dawn, toward whatever came after choosing family over empire. Behind them, the cartels could have Mexico. They were going home.